started back out of the harbor. We're going to go back past State Pier, the pier that we left from, and the pier at which the Mayflower II is berthed. The Mayflower II was built in England in 1955, and it was sailed over here in 1957. It was built as part of the celebration of the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. It was a gift of the people of England to the people of Plymouth, Massachusetts. It is now owned and operated by Plymouth Plantation. When they decided that they were going to build a replica of the Mayflower, there were no plans or even sketches of the original vessel. They didn't know exactly what it looked like. They had some overall dimensional information, but they didn't know what it looked like. So they based the replica upon what would have been a traditional 16th century English merchant vessel. Which is exactly what the original Mayflower was. It had been used to transport wine and produce from France over to England before it was used by the Pilgrims. In Governor Bradford's journals, he referred to the Mayflower as being a sweet ship. Bit of an odd name, but use of it. What he really meant by that was that as I said, it had been used to transport wine and produce from France over to England, and some of the kegs of wine, some of the barrels of wine had leaked, and the cargo deck and the hull had the sweet smell of wine. She's 138 feet overall. That includes that big long bowsprit. She's only 90 feet on the water.
So the one long horn is to tell everyone in the area that we're leaving the dock, and then the three shortest talk while we're doing so in reverse. So the Mayflower 2 did come to us from the people of Plymouth, England. It made the same journey that the original Mayflower made across the Atlantic. It took them 55 days in 1957 when they replicated it, which was only 11 days shorter than it took the original Mayflower to make it all the way across the Atlantic. You can take tours on the Mayflower. There's a whole museum exhibit ahead of it. You can actually go on board. You can see some people on there now. There's also a small boat that's attached to the Mayflower, and that's called a shell, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I want to point it out to you now. We will be spinning around, so then you'll get another look at the Mayflower on the right-hand side of the turn. Now the Mayflower 2 is seaworthy, although she doesn't get off the dock very often. She had to get out this past winter. She has 4 fishing. It looks like she does stay time to the dock. Last summer we had a lot of visitors who came to see the Mayflower, but she actually put the here. She had a lot of woodworking done to her over the summer, so taken to the spring, but they couldn't find the right wood to make it authentic. So it did take them longer, and she did return to us in August or last year.
Along the shoreline before to go over the rock. There is no mention of Plymouth Rock in the Bradford Times, and he doesn't say a thing about Plymouth Rock. The story goes that as they were approaching the first centennial, 1720, the turn of the century, they were looking for something to rally around. I'm not sure why they needed that, but they were looking for something to rally around. There were no surviving members of the original Mayflower group at that time, but there was an old town elder, Elder Fonz, who was 94 years old, and he had grown up with the Pilgrims. He had known them all personally. Well, he carried him in a chair down to the waterfront, and as the reports go, they asked him what was of significance on the waterfront. He said, well, they told me that they landed right over there by that big rock, and that big rock was very important to them. And that became the legend of Plymouth Rock, and the point of the first celebration and many to come. At one point, the rock was split in thirds. 2/3 of it was taken up into the center of Plymouth. People used to come along with a hammer and chip off a piece of it and take it home as a souvenir. And I understand there's a chunk of it in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Well, again, on another one of those centennials, the tricentennial of 1920, the state of Massachusetts purchased the land on both sides of the rock, tore down all the old wharfs that were there, did some filling, and created the park that you see here today. They then reassembled as much of the rock as they could find, as less than a third its original size, and placed it down on the waterfront approximately where the original had been. then built that big portico over the top of it. If you continue to look along the waterfront, you'll see the big marina with all the yachts and boats in it. Well, between the marina and the state park, there's a little outlet there, and that's where Town Brook flows into Plymouth Harbor. And Town Brook is also an important part of that Pilgrim story, which we will get to shortly. Notice over on the left-hand side of the vessel, you see a large granite block breakwater. It's 3/4 of a mile long. You can walk out on it. It was completed in 1960, and when it was completed, they dredged out behind it and created the mooring field which you see here today. We have on average an 11-foot tide here in Plymouth. At times of full moon, the tide can be even greater, as much as 12 and 13 feet, higher highs and lower lows. But we just passed full moon, so we've been experiencing higher and higher tides, higher and lower. We use that breakwater as kind of a guide to where we are in the tide cycle. You can see that brown line that runs along the breakwater. If you can't see the breakwater or the line, you know that we're at high tide. It was low tide this morning at 10:50 feet, so we're now on a flood tide, an incoming tide, and it will be high tide this afternoon at 4 o'clock, 4:08. Looking at the breakwater again, it looks like we've got about 5 feet to go on the tide cycle. If it were low tide, we were down some 6 or 7 feet from where we are right now. You would see on both sides of the channel large sand flats that are exposed at low tide. Plymouth Harbor was shallow before it was dredged. And the Mayflower would never have come into this inner portion of the harbor. It would have stayed out near the end of the point where we're headed. And they would have used that little boat, the shallop I pointed out alongside of the Mayflower, they would have used it to transfer the Pilgrims into shore. So when Elder Font said that they landed over there by that rock, he really meant they were stepping off the shallop onto dry land, not directly from the Mayflower. That little boat, the shallop that they had brought over in pieces on the Mayflower, they assembled it and rigged it, and they started searching around the inside of Cape Cod looking for running fresh water. The first substantial or real continually running freshwater stream that they came to was Town Brook in Plymouth. That spot I pointed out by the marina at the state park. It was then, as it is today, 365 days a year, a running freshwater stream. There were natives living in the area at the time, and they were growing their crops very well, so they knew the land was good to grow their crops in. They looked at the harbor, they saw this outer barrier beach that we're alongside of now. It was a protected harbor, not a great harbor, but a good harbor. They had good land, good harbor, plenty of water, and they made the decision to stay here in what they called barrier beach that we're now alongside of. It's called Plymouth Long Beach. It's 3.5 miles long from its northern tip in front of us to behind us where it connects into land. The houses you see out here are all privately owned, and they must supply their own electricity and water. Today they use solar panels, windmills, and propane gas for heat, light, and refrigeration. They changed from originally nothing much more than little gunning shacks on the beach into these larger and larger houses out here. They've become very desirable. They have this great inside harbor view and wonderful sunsets and that great sandy beach on the outside. And here comes one of our less polite mariners right past us in full speed. Over the years, Plymouth Beach has suffered from a substantial amount of erosion. One of the worst storms was a no-name storm of the winter of '78, and shortly thereafter the town of Plymouth embarked on a beach restoration program. Before that, you could take your four-wheel drive vehicle, beach buggy, out on the beach and literally go crashing through the dunes. Well, they stopped that. You can no longer go near the dunes. And they started replanting the yellowy green grass you see out there. Beach grass is critical to the beach because it captures the sand that's blown around in the wind. And just by replanting and protecting the beach grass, the dunes have started to reconstitute themselves. They still suffer from many winter storms, but at least now there's a natural cycle to it. At that same time, back in '78, the town also declared that this whole northern tip of the beach, from that last house with the green trim on it out to the end of the point, would be a bird sanctuary. It's particularly important in the spring of the year when the nesting of a little endangered beach tern called a piping plover is nesting. And in the early spring, this whole end of the beach is completely restricted. You're not allowed out on it at all. At this time of year, you can use the beach below the high water mark. We're approaching high water, so the beach is getting smaller. But you'll notice a number of yellow signs on posts at the base of the sand dunes, and those signs tell people that they are never allowed to go up into the sand dunes. That's protect the grass and the nesting birds. The bird sanctuary program has been very effective, and as we reach the end of the point, I'm sure you'll see a number of flocks of birds sitting on the beach or flying above the dunes. Switching sides now, looking back into the town of Plymouth, into the village. Towards the north end or right end of town, it's pretty hard to see at this time of day because of the angle of the sun, but you see that green and white striped tent down on the waterfront. Well, just a little past that, just sticking above the top of the trees, is a large granite monument. A woman with her right arm held to the heavens. That is the Forefathers Monument. On another one of those centennials, the bicentennial in 1820, they decided to build that monument in honor of our Pilgrim forefathers. It wasn't completed until the late 1860s. Budgets were tight, and they actually reduced the scale of the project by 50%, so it's only half the size it was originally intended to be. But if you're over by it, it is a very beautiful, beautifully carved, freestanding granite monument, very large. Some people say it looks a lot like the Statue of Liberty, but in fact it predates the Statue of Liberty by many years. So you could rightfully say the Statue of Liberty looks an awful lot like the Forefathers Monument. If you continue to look along the shoreline up to the north, you'll see a large smokestack and some large red brick factory buildings. That was the Plymouth Portage Company, and we'll talk more about the Portage Company in a little bit. But just past those buildings, about 2 blocks, is the Plymouth-Kingston town line, the northern end of the town of Plymouth. If you were to go 17 miles to the south, you would reach the southern end of the town of Plymouth. During the Revolutionary War, it was named after General Benedict Arnold, the Revolutionary War hero from Vermont at first, unfortunately turned out to be a traitor. But it sailed out of Boston in the winter of 1778, and it sailed into a terrible nor'easter, a terrible winter storm. Guess they didn't check the weather channel. So the captain decided to come in here to Plymouth to get away from the storm. And as he came around the end of the point which we're approaching, he dropped anchor, but the wind, the waves, and the tide, the current, swept the ship over onto the sand flat between us and the cordage company over on our left. The wind and the waves started to beat the ship apart. So the captain ordered all of the guns fired in an effort to arouse the people of Plymouth. Well, even though it was close to shore, it was 1778, the equipment wasn't very good. And it took 3 days before the people of Plymouth could get out to the vessel. The reason they could get out in 3 days was because the harbor froze solid. They could walk out on the ice. Tragically, 66 of the 80 some odd sailors on board had died. Most of them had frozen to death on the deck of the ship. They took the survivors and the dead back into Plymouth, and they buried the dead in a single grave up at the top of Coles Hill. And we'll talk a little bit more about Coles Hill when we get back into the harbor. Looking now back over to our right, past the end of the point, Plymouth Beach. You'll see a little red and white lighthouse. We're going to go right over to that lighthouse. We'll get up right up close to it. You can take pictures when we get there. And I will tell you a little bit more about it when we get over there. But if you look directly behind it, you'll see a piece of land with a large gray house in the middle of it. That's an island, and it's called Clark's Island. It was named after John Clark, the first mate of the Mayflower. We're going to talk a little bit more about Clark's Island in just a minute. But if you look further to the east, you'll see a sandy beach with houses on it similar to Plymouth Beach. It's called Saintwish. That's the native term for beach of many clams and mussels. And Saintwish stretches further out to the east to a point of land called Vernon Point, the little white lighthouse. Because they didn't know if the natives would be hostile. Well, on a beautiful clear day, beautiful sunshiny clear day in December of 1620, they brought the Mayflower over here into Plymouth. They came around and anchored behind Saintwish. They had done some scouting over on Clark's Island, that little island to our left, and determined that there were no natives living on the island at the time. So they used that boat, the shallop, and they transferred the Pilgrims into shore on Clark's Island. For most of the Pilgrims, it was the first time they had set foot on dry land since leaving England some 90 plus days before. There's a large flat table rock in the middle of the island. They used it as an altar, and they held their first religious services on dry land in the New World. After the services were over, they took advantage of the sunshiny day, and they stretched their sopping wet clothing out on the rocks to dry. As you can imagine, it was a particularly important day for the Pilgrims. They still honor that day every year with a service out on the island. They don't do it in December, however. They do it in July. And this is before they come over and landed in Plymouth by the Rock. The little red and white lighthouse which we're now approaching, its formal name is called Duxbury Pier Light. However, the locals have always had a different name for it. As I mentioned earlier, lobsters were plentiful in Plymouth Harbor and the surrounding areas. Well, if you look closely at a lobster, it has kind of beady eyes. For many years, lobsters were called bugs. Well, lobsters love rocks. You can see those rocks off to the left of the lighthouse. That's why they built the lighthouse here, was to protect sailors from those rocks and the ledge below it. Well, those rocks used to be full of lobsters, and this lighthouse has always been same organization has now changed its name from Save Club Light to Save Our Lights Bureau. It also started
Oh, it's done?